When it comes to the main entries in the Resident Evil series, one of the games that always ends up being pretty low on everyone's list seems to be Resident Evil 5.
Resident Evil 5.
A title which had the unfortunate fate of being released after the seminal Resident Evil 4. As a result, RE5 seemed to be both lauded and ridiculed because of how similar it was to that fourth game. And alongside a bunch of other reasons, it's always been a bit of an outlier, and a game that seems to often end up at the bottom of people's rankings. Which is a bit of a shame because that's a fate that it doesn't really deserve. Because despite pushing the series in an often different direction, it's still at its core a really solid survival horror shooter. Just, you know, sometimes without the horror. And along with the first few games, it's something I often find myself coming back to replay every year or so. And with the recent RE4 remake and its whole epilogue sequence, no spoilers, I'd say that it's all but confirmed at this point, or at least very likely, that we can expect this fifth game to also get a revival. So as a result, I thought it might be worth going back and taking a look at what I think is one of the most underappreciated entries in the franchise. You know, before the remake gets confirmed and everyone else starts saying the same thing.
Splendid timing!
Right, so originally released in 2009 for the PS3, the Xbox 360 and PC, the setting this time changes things up yet again. Moving from the brown and grey backdrop of Europe to West Africa, with Chris Redfield returning as the protagonist. Stories that Chris is heading to Africa to apprehend an arms dealer named Ricardo Irving, who's selling off some kind of bioweapon on the black market. With this guy quickly taking center stage as this annoying, smarmy little douchebag with an incredibly punchable face.
Wow, perceptive, aren't ya?
But also one who's incredibly hard to apprehend, because he's frequently bailed out by this mysterious, very clearly female character who's dressed up like a plague doctor. Considering Chris's backstory at this point as well, involving an encounter himself and Jill Valentine had with Wesker, it is also blatantly obvious from the get-go who this hooded figure actually is. But then again, I don't think it was ever supposed to be this super elaborate, well-told story. And RE5 is often pure schlock, but in the best way possible. With no better evidence of that being Chris's new physique. And I seem to remember that a significant amount of discussion back in 2009 centered around how ridiculously massive Chris had gotten in this game, which was in stark comparison to how he looked back in Code Veronica. And it's always kind of stuck out to me as a bit weird with the RE fandom in the way that people seem to be confused as to why Chris was so jacked up in this game. Like they expected the guy whose job it is to fight literal monsters to not be in absolute peak physical form. You ever see any of the Rocky movies? How before the final fight, there's always a montage of Rocky lifting all this heavy stuff, you know, and training super hard in some shithole gym somewhere? Yeah, well, it's safe to say that at some point, Chris probably did the same. I mean, if you're going to be racing F1 cars, man, you're going to turn up to the track in a McLaren, not a Prius. And I've just never understood how it wasn't obvious from the get-go why he had to be in that kind of condition. Off the back of that too, the whole boulder punching sequence, which some people seem to think was about Chris trying to literally punch a boulder to pieces.
Wrong!
Instead of recognizing it as a byproduct of the rage and adrenaline he had coursing through his veins at the time, you know, along with Tren and D-Bowl. Also considering he was in a duel to the death with his nemesis and fighting to save his partner from being killed. And I mean, damn dog, if your partner looked like Sheva too, well, you'd probably do the same.
You don't have to get touchy.
But I don't know, I guess in a game where you're fighting giant cockroaches, the simple premise of a man being buffed up to shit is the one part that doesn't make sense. Yeah, sure. Either way though, I've always enjoyed the story in Resident Evil 5, along with the way that it manages to bring back a lot of familiar faces, but also introduce a few new ones as well.
No!
The setting itself feels unique as well, especially considering that we've spent quite a lot of time in or around Raccoon City in the past. And compared to arriving in Spain in RE4, which was mostly deserted, Africa in Resident Evil 5 feels like a real bustling place. There was always a lot of criticism regarding the visuals as well, with people often complaining about that overall filter, going so far as to even create mods that remove that look entirely. But I've always thought that visual style does a great job of separating RE5 from the previous entries, and the way that it reinforces how you're trapped in this dirty and humid nightmare is second to none. The whole place just feels instantly alien and hostile, with the locals giving Chris dirty looks and barely hiding their hatred before the place quickly becomes, ominously deserted.
Boy, this party really died.
And even going back and replaying through it now in 2024, I was actually kind of surprised at how good a lot of these environments still look. Just proves yet again that a decent art style truly doesn't age, and when you compare it to RE6, where they tried to go for a more realistic tone, this one just looks even better. I just feel like it's supposed to show how Chris is out of his element, and it captures that really well. He doesn't speak the language, he doesn't know his way around, and he just looks incredibly out of place.
Mostly just rumors.
The story eventually explores the origins of the progenitor virus, which is what that T virus was originally developed from, along with going into some of Wesker's backstory and the reason why he's got all these superhuman abilities. Oh yeah, and speaking of Wesker, this has to be the best iteration of this guy as well. And he's just such a comically over-the-top villain in this entry that it's impossible to not smile like a jackass every time he's on the screen. I mean, he's got the slicked back hair, the sunglasses, and that tight leather outfit that really captures that mid-2000s post-Matrix era perfectly. Where it seemed like the more black, tight-fitting clothes you wore, the cooler you were. In fact, he was such a badass that they pretty much carried this version of him over entirely into Dead by Daylight. Speaking of over-the-top villains, you've got the sadistic Italian billionaire Excella Gioni as well, who walks around in a cocktail dress the entire time with her boobs hanging out. Also too, showing off some pretty damn impressive physics for the time.
I believe I've proven I'm worthy, haven't I?
She's the classic rich bitch trope who just acts like a bit of a spoiled brat and clearly isn't used to hearing the word no, only to get exactly what she deserves in the end.
Perhaps you have.
But the best new character by far has to be Sheva.
Welcome to Africa. My name is Sheva Alama.
I think I found my wife. I'm not gonna lie.
And for the entirety of the game, she's around to assist Chris, with a lot of the levels being outright designed around working together, whether it be kicking down doors, activating switches, or even having her bail you out during combat. At certain times, Chris and her even separate completely, with one having to watch the other's back from another vantage point, which makes for some harrowing sequences. And you can tell that the campaign's really been designed around co-op play, which is where it truly does shine. But having said that though, I also find it quite a lot of fun playing in solo mode as well. Simply because choosing what weapons and items to give to Sheva plays a big part in how well you do overall.
You grab it.
Okay.
And about the only downside is that she's incredibly overzealous when it comes to healing. I mean, if you so much as stub your toe or bite your tongue, she pops up out of nowhere to hit you in the face with one of those green and red sprays, as if those things fucking grow on trees.
Are you okay?
She also makes certain areas way tougher than they should be, like going up against Lycus, for instance, because she obviously didn't get the memo that those things are blind. And she ends up making more noise than a roided up pit bull with a cowbell tied around its balls. She can also occasionally be on the brunt end of enemy attacks that otherwise could have been easily avoided. And I don't even think it's possible to beat the game on veteran or professional mode as well, because some of the boss fights are next to impossible with her AI. But otherwise though, outside of that, she's really one of the most underrated characters in the entire Resident Evil franchise. And put a rifle in her hand or an SMG and she's got your back the entire time, partner. Not to mention, she has hands down some of the best unlockable outfits in any game, perhaps ever. And there's just something so hilarious about watching all these serious cinematics and seeing Chris and her decked out in these ridiculous novelty costumes.
My parents were involved in an accident caused by a pharmaceutical company when I was young.
Honestly, it's just kind of criminal that Capcom never brought her back. And outside of appearing in Dead by Daylight, which isn't even a Resident Evil game, she's never even got a mention or a reference in any single other game since. Nothing.
That is unacceptable.
I agree. It's unacceptable.
But either way though, she's got to be in the top 5 for the most underappreciated video game characters, along with my boy Adrian Shepard from Opposing Force. Now, a big part of why this thing got a lot of criticism at the time was that, like I said before, it did have the unfortunate luck of having to follow hot on the heels of RE4, which understandably left fans with high expectations. And what's not helping things either is that it really is kind of easy to compare this thing to RE4. I mean, in both games, the protagonist is coming to a village in an isolated place to soon find out that the locals are infected by a virus, which in both instances happens to be a strain of the Las Plagas. In RE4 it was the Ganados, and in RE5 it's the Magini. And much like the Ganados, it's also common to see the Magini mutate during combat, with appendages and other nasty growths coming out of their bodies when they take damage. Early on in both games, you're attacked by a single infected in a somewhat low-threat environment, before then, shortly after, you're detected by a large group of them. And then have to hold out in a town square of sorts until a timer runs out. And in both instances, it's more or less like a mini arena, where you've got multiple routes to move around so you don't get boxed in, along with environmental traps and ladders you can use to your advantage. Topped off with a seriously oversized enemy chasing after you. Now in RE4 it was Dr. Salvador, and then in RE5 it's the Executioner. Having said that though, they still kind of bring Dr. Salvador back as well, at least in spirit, with there being Magini armed with chainsaws who, like your mum, go around wearing bags over their head. Cinematics and other sequences often require quick button inputs to avoid certain death, and much like RE4, I still find these to be the absolute ruiner of a good time. Mostly because I'm often too distracted and invested by what's going on in that cinematic, to remember that I'm supposed to be reacting to what's happening on the screen. Doesn't help either that the combinations are kinda weird on the PC, like pressing F and V at the same time. Luckily though, you can turn this shit off in the options menu, so my advice there is do that as soon as you can. Making money to purchase items and upgrade all your weapons is again done by picking up cash and collecting treasure, though this is now a much simpler process. Because compared to RE4, where you could often hold onto something for literally hours, until finally putting all the pieces together and then selling it for 4 or 5 times the value,
Thank you.
loot in Resident Evil 5 can be sold as soon as you've picked it up. I would even say as well that RE5 has its own version of the infamous RE4 water room. This time being a sequence inside an underground temple where you've got to avoid literal blasts from the sun, navigating a crumbling maze of stone passageways, along with being attacked by the locals. It shows up about maybe halfway or so into the campaign, like the water room did, and again, it is an absolute filter, being a noticeable spike in difficulty. But even more than that, it's Resident Evil 5's combat, where it just really builds upon everything that RE4 did before it. So it's again a combination of the classic tank controls combined with a somewhat more modern third-person shooter, which means while you can strafe left and right, when you're sprinting, you can only turn left and right. And when you aim with a weapon, you still get locked in place like you're a human gun turret. The shooting's also got those nice little details that RE4 introduced, things like being able to shoot explosives out of midair, or even shooting the dynamite in someone's hand and causing it to blow up on the spot. Shoot someone in the leg and they'll fall down to one knee, shoot them in the head and they'll grab their face in pain. And as always, shotguns are still the best form of crowd control, able to knock over large groups of enemies at once. If you stagger an enemy, it leaves them wide open to a powerful melee attack like a ground pound or an uppercut, moves which are not only great at conserving ammo, but just also kinda hilarious. Because watching Chris push in the shit of some poor infected villager half his size is something that is never not funny. And also too, seeing Chris and Sheva side by side, it's like the textbook example of when you have a strength versus agility build in an RPG. But more than that though, like, it's again just got that great amount of hit feedback where you really know when a shot is connected. The shotguns are still the most satisfying weapons to use in that regard, and that loud crunch you get when you remove someone's head with a critical hit is just pure ASMR.
Now, this is epic.
More so too, I think, when it occurs with the pistols, because that's something you expect to happen far less. As for the rifles, they again have pixel-precise aiming, and if an enemy is so much as sticking their pinky toe out from behind cover, well, then you're able to hit it. And of course, as you'd expect for a Resident Evil game, you've also got those much harder hitting weapons like the grenade launcher, the Magnum, and the rocket launcher.
Rocket launcher!
With the latter being incredibly expensive and rare, but again useful as a means of quickly one-shotting certain annoying enemy types. Now, I first played RE5 on my PS3 back when it first came out, and I do remember it being pretty damn challenging. But playing it on the PC, like, the whole thing almost seems unfair for the enemies, because their slow movement speed combined with the ease of aiming with a mouse just makes the combat far too easy. Even with a basic weapon like a pistol, you can easily stun lock a group of Magini with repeated headshots, and when you've got an upgraded rifle or the Magnum, I mean, forget about it. What I appreciate though is how there's not always a one-size-fits-all weapon for each category. I mean, in RE4 for instance, it seemed like once you found the Red 9 and upgraded it, that was about all you ever needed so far as pistols went. Same thing for the shotguns with the Striker, a weapon that not only did good damage, but also had a huge magazine size. In RE5 though, it's not quite as cut and dry. The weapon that's more or less RE5's version of the Striker is the Jailbreaker, which looks more or less the same, but has a much smaller capacity, even than some of the other shotguns you've found prior. With the pistols, although there's like 3 or 4 in total you can buy, I always just end up using the starting Beretta for the entire game. Because when this thing is fully upgraded, its total mag size ends up being 100 rounds, which means you more or less never have to reload it. And the bonus of being able to fire for that long, uninterrupted, offsets the fact that it doesn't hit as hard as some of those other pistols. As for the rifles, that bolt-action S75 you get early on does the most damage by far. However, it has a tedious cycling animation between each shot, whereas you can then choose to sacrifice damage for semi-auto if you want to go for the SVD or the PSG. My point is that the stuff like this makes it so the combat becomes more about the player's own personal preference, in regards to things like damage, capacity, and reload times, as opposed to there just being objectively better versions of each gun. So an AK-74 isn't necessarily going to be better than an MP5. It all just kind of depends on your playstyle. And I feel like that layer of choice is a factor to RE5's combat that often seems to get overlooked. What's also good about this entry is that it's the first main game in the series to let you assign guns and items to a quick swap menu, removing the need to artificially pause the game every single time you wanted to change weapons, which is something that even RE4 in all its overstated glory was guilty of. Now this does wonders for the pacing and flow of the moment-to-moment gameplay, but it also just adds in a bit of a tactical element, because you can no longer magically pause the action around you to heal or swap out weapons when things get too spicy. There is a downside though, in that you can often be stuck between a rock and a pile of shit if you've just flat out brought the wrong gear. You know, where you pretty much find yourself in a bringing a knife to a gunfight situation. But otherwise, it's a really good addition, which helps to remove a lot of the stop-start element from the previous games. There is definitely something kind of arrogantly old school about RE5's controls though, and it does seem kind of defiant, especially considering how much the shooter genre had evolved by this point. I mean, you got to consider that Gears of War came out in 2006, and even the second game had come out a year prior in 2008. And yet here we are in 2009 with a game that more or less still controls like its predecessor from way back in 2005. In an era where the whole freedom of movement and cover shooting mechanic, along with regenerating health, was really starting to pick up, here's a game where you can only take cover in specific areas, and where you can lose almost your entire health bar in a single hit. And as a result of that, RE5 does suffer a fair bit during those moments, where it really seems to be trying to pass itself off as a cover shooter. Every now and then you'll come across a wall or a waist-high object you can hide behind, popping out to take shots at enemies hiding on the other side of the room. And I don't know if this stuff was added in later during development, but it really does seem out of place with the earlier combat sequences. And it just sticks out as some of the roughest areas in the campaign. It's also definitely the most un-Resident Evil that the series had felt up until that point. You know, until RE6 came out a few years later.
Master was waiting for us.
Hold it! What the hell is that shit?
And that right there is probably another big reason why people reacted so negatively, because by this point, this truly is barely survival horror. I mean, it might have a few of the hallmarks, like fighting zombie dogs and staying on your feet by ingesting red and green plants, but really otherwise, this is just a big, dumb action movie.
Thank me later. We got company.
I'm on it.
Got you, Kevin.
Capcom didn't just jump the shark here either, they've left the Earth's orbit completely. And some of the sequences are so bizarre and just out of place. Like seeing Sheva and Chris getting ambushed by a gang of Magini, all riding motorbikes and carrying chain whips, which honestly feels like something out of a Streets of Rage game. There's a jeep chase sequence early on through the desert where you're shooting a machine gun at hordes of these guys chasing after you, where the term horror isn't even in the vocabulary. Followed by exploring the wetlands in an airboat in broad daylight, which almost feels like something out of an entirely different game. Funnily enough though, it's actually kind of similar to the boat section in the RE4 remake. There's another sequence after that involving like a boat chase on rails, where you just shoot at explosive canisters that may as well have neon arrows pointing towards them. And all up, I think there's really only one actual puzzle in the entire game. Though I struggle to even call it that because you're likely to solve this in a matter of minutes. To be honest though, none of this has ever really bothered me, and I've never understood the complaint about how this game being so different is what makes it so bad. The fact that this series is constantly trying to change things up is something I've always found to be the aspect that makes these games so unique and interesting. Which is part of the reason why I didn't have any real issues fighting a family of redneck cannibals in RE7, along with what was more or less vampires and werewolves in RE8. Having said that though, Resident Evil 5 definitely does get a bit too dumb at times. Like how they often throw a heap of the tougher enemies at you in a blatant attempt to make certain areas more challenging, but also just as a means to slow down your progression. At one point after you've just killed one of those chainsaw Magini for instance, you fight another one literally 10 seconds later. To the point that in an almost fourth wall breaking moment, Sheva comments on it directly, no doubt vocalizing what the player was already thinking. And then even further on than that, you start to fight Magini armed with miniguns, who also happen to be smoking cigars and wearing gold jewelry as if they're Mr. T impersonators. Well, how about this bit on like a conveyor belt that seems to be the manufacturing plant for the red explosive barrels in every video game that ever existed. And then throw in a couple of cheap enemy placements here and there with guys armed with RPGs, and yeah, you can kind of start to see how frustrating the combat often felt to certain players. But I really do like some of these new enemy designs otherwise.
Are you okay?
Like those little spider things that come bursting out of the ground to chase after you. I mean, those things are fucking disgusting in a good way. Well, how about the Reapers, these huge mutated cockroaches covered in thick armor, which funnily enough are best killed with a pistol.
Brother,
I mean, these things are just so gross and hideous, letting off a noxious gas attack if you get too close, and having one of the nastiest death animations I think in the entire franchise.
That's gotta hurt! It's gotta hurt!
I still reckon the Chimera in the first game are the most disturbing enemies in the entire series, but these guys right here I'd put as a close second. And any enemy that's got an instant death attack is not to be fucked with.
what's that, brother?
But it's the boss fights though, which is the main area where RE5 kind of suffers.
Wow, perceptive, aren't ya?
Now, I've never really been a huge fan of the boss fights in the Resident Evil games. I've always just kind of accepted them as the necessary evil you have to put up with, in between the moment-to-moment gameplay, which is the stuff that I enjoy the most. And I feel like Resident Evil bosses are only bad the first time you have to play them, because then after that you're often facing them in New Game Plus mode, where you've often got better gear but also just a better understanding of how to defeat them. Either way though, they've never been much more than just shooting something over and over in an obnoxiously obvious weak spot, having to use all your best and heaviest weapons in the process. And in fact, off the back of that, for the first boss in RE5, you're not even going to be able to beat this thing with your standard weapons just because of how weak they're going to be on a first playthrough. And as a result, you have to use the environment to your advantage. Even the second time you fight this thing, that whole encounter seems to be the sole reason why the game gives you a free rocket launcher. Because with that weapon, you can finish the boss off in a single hit.
Rocket launcher.
As for the second main boss, well, this thing's like a giant bat/wasp, and to defeat it, you simply knock it over with grenades or explosive mines. Followed by shooting its abdomen over and over, which is neither hard or creative, and again, just a bit of a bane on your resources. Speaking of resources, for one of the later bosses, I'm not even sure how you'd get past this one on a first playthrough if you didn't have explosives. Because the main strategy for defeating it is shooting its arms until it drops down, before then running up and throwing a grenade in its mouth, which is a tactic that has to be repeated 3 or 4 times.
Just die already!
But the most annoying fight by far though is the Wesker and Jill fight.
Stop this! Jill, answer me!
Yeah, so in what comes as a complete non-surprise to every single person who ever played RE5, that hooded figure helping Irving throughout the game has been Jill Valentine all along.
Jill.
Who's apparently brainwashed or under mind control or something. Either way, they bleached her hair blonde, which, yeah, means she's evil now. But seeing as she's still your gal pal, throughout this fight, you're not supposed to attack her. So instead, you got to pull out all the tricks from your boxer judo moves to keep her subdued, mashing buttons like your life depended on it to remove the mind control device from her chest. Yeah, mind control device from her chest. Alright. But before you can even get to this point, you first got to avoid Wesker, who slowly walks around the area like he's Jason Voorhees, kicking the absolute shit out of Chris if he gets too close.
How disappointing.
And that's not even the end of things either, because you've still got multiple encounters against Wesker to come, which is its own can of worms entirely. And only after another hour or so of shooting Magini arm with miniguns and more giant cockroaches have you got that final climactic showdown. Now this is essentially broken down into 3 fights. For the first one, Wesker's still human, kind of, and just slowly walks around this large hangar, where you can switch off nearby lights to the point that he can't even see Chris or Sheva at all. Yeah, all these superpowers and inhuman reflexes, and yet the guy's not smart enough to take off his sunglasses.
I would expect you to be happier to see us.
Anyway, the goal here is to shoot him a few times with the rocket launcher, where he's able to catch that thing in midair, but letting you quickly shoot it to blow it up in his face. Simple.
I've got you now!
The next fight after that is more or less like an interactive movie, being a series of quick-time events during a cinematic, where you just need to press the right inputs at all the right times. And this one's kind of a shame because all of the coolest fight stuff you get to see with Chris and Wesker is something that you don't even really get to play a part in. Though it does have my favourite line of dialogue in the entire game.
I've had enough of your bullshit! You're just another one of Umbrella's leftovers. It's gotta hurt!
Then finally there's the last form where Wesker turns into Iron Man, and yeah, I'm not talking about the Robert Downey Jr. version either, pursuing Cress and Sheva in the guts of an active volcano. Something which is an awesome spectacle as far as boss fights go, and also includes that iconic boulder punching sequence. Topped off with Wesker being finished off for good with not only 1, but 2 rocket launches to the face.
Time's up, you son of a bitch.
Woo! You know you did.
And how we went from shooting poor infected humans in a dusty village to watching a mutated freak with metal claws for hands meeting his demise in liquid hot magma is anyone's guess. But hey, there you have it. That's the ending for Resident Evil 5. It even ends with the characters all riding off into the sunset in a chopper. Classic. But that's not even close to being all that RE5 has to offer. Because like a lot of the other games in the series, where this thing absolutely excels is in the bonus content and the New Game Plus mode. Going back to do all those boss fights that were next to impossible on a first time playthrough, but then become a bit of a cakewalk on a second, third and fourth attempt. And if you can't enjoy the simple pleasures in life, that being beating a video game with an infinite ammo minigun, well, then is life even worth living? The other main component the game offers up is the Mercenaries mode, which at this point was starting to become as much of a staple of the series as red and green herbs. And this is definitely one of my favourite iterations, even if I am still pretty fucking bad at it. The premise is again pretty simple. You're dropped into a sectioned off area, usually one taken from the campaign, and then have to hold out whilst killing as many enemies as possible in a set time limit. You can extend the timer by finding pickups around the map, and the idea is that you're trying to get the highest score possible.
The mission's over. Let's head home.
With a B rank unlocking the next stage and an A rank unlocking a new character to play as. And this ends up being the most important feature because some of these characters are objectively better than others. You start off with only Chris and Sheva, who have a pretty basic loadout, lacking any of the harder hitting weapons, which makes them pretty much useless. But before too long, you'll unlock Wesker, who comes with a better pistol, along with a hand cannon, not to mention some of the best melee attacks in the game. Along with that, you get better variants of Chris and Sheva, like the version of Chris in his Stars outfit, where he carries an assault rifle and the Magnum. And then Tribal Sheva, who is absolutely broken, carrying around that infinite ammo bow, which is able to kill the standard enemies with a single arrow. And then apart from that, you've got two playable versions of Jill Valentine, you know, just to top it all off.
What'd they die of?
Crushed pelvises.
Yes!
Oh, thank you, Lord in heaven.
If you've got the Gold Edition and all the DLC, you can even play Mercenaries Reunion, which adds in a whole heap of even more broken characters, like Barry Burton and Rebecca Chambers. Barry, as you'd expect, gets his trademark Magnum, and Rebecca is surprisingly overpowered too, coming with a fully upgraded Jailbreaker. Now, my theory here is that because Rebecca is such a cutie pie and has to be protected at all costs, that they gave her the most broken loadout possible as a means to prevent any kind of harm from befalling her. But the best character here by far is Excella, who runs around in that incredibly revealing outfit and treats all the Magini like she's a dom and they're her subs or something. Her melee attacks, for instance, consist of slapping people in the face and stomping on them with their high heels while they're on the ground. And look, like, I still don't know how I feel about that, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me that thoroughly enjoyed dishing out pain in that manner.
What does that have to do with it?
No. He's got a point.
Playing Mercs in co-op mode is also a whole lot of fun too, doubling the points requirement needed for each rank, but also doubling the amount of enemies more or less too, which just causes absolute chaos. The only downside is that the whole thing is kinda piss easy, and you can unlock all the stages and characters within a matter of hours. There is value in playing this mode over and over though, because each time you beat a stage, you earn special points that can then be spent on purchasing all the bonus and side content, like all of these much needed 3D figurines.
I believe I've proven I'm worthy.
Or even cheats like infinite ammo for all of the weapons. And you could easily spend hours and hours alone just trying to unlock infinite ammo for all of the guns. Because before you can buy this, you first need to max out all the upgrades for a weapon to begin with. And this can cost anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 dues. In fact, I still remember playing some of those chapters over and over on my PS3, all just to farm jewels dropped by enemies or all of those chests, which is something I absolutely don't have the patience to do anymore. But it just goes to show you how much value and longevity that RE5 has, and that's not even considering the other DLC campaigns as well. And it all just again plays a bit of a part in why I've just never understood why people seem to say this is one of the weakest main games in the series, when just on sheer value and content alone, you're more than getting your money's worth. When that inevitable RE5 remake finally gets announced, I think we're going to suddenly see a lot of fans coming out of the woodwork to sing this game's praises, which is fine, they're well earned. I just kind of wish it had gotten the credence it deserved over the last decade or so, you know, instead of being unfairly labelled as some kind of a bad entry. Having said all of that though, like, there is room for improvement, and I do hope they can add in the more standard third-person controls, like what they did with the RE4 remake. I assume too they'll also include and build upon all the new combat moves they gave Leon in the RE4 remake, which means that Chris is basically going to turn into Drax the Destroyer. At the end of the day, people are going to argue over the quality of RE5, and look, that's fine. But if nothing else, I hope we can all still agree that Resident Evil 6 is complete dog shit.
What's that? What's that, brother?